Yeah, thank you, Noirine. So yes, yeah, my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who I've had the opportunity to interact with because she's the founder of the Marine Social Science Network, and she's Emma McKinley, Dr. Emma McKinley, researcher, fellow at the University of Cardiff. She has been working in and for ocean literacy for many, many years. And yeah, we look forward to hear your presentation now, Emma.
Thanks, Maria. Let me just share my screen. And hopefully you guys can see that.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Perfect. Great. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. How I wish we could be in person and I could be at home and in your company, but never mind. We are managing to bring all these lovely people together. As Maria said, I'm Emma McKinley. I'm a research fellow at Cardiff University, and I also am the chair of the Marine Social Science Network, which I'll do a little bit of a plug for later. But I'm really going to build on some of what Diz has already talked about and draw on some of the experiences that we're having here in the UK. So I've been based over here for a very long time, longer than I care to remember. But before I get started, I actually wanted to try and get some audience participation as we're going. So I know we've already introduced ourselves in the chat, but what I'd love to ask you to do is tell us what you think of when you hear the word ocean. What do you think about when you hear that word? And pop that in the chat. And I'm going to have a quick look and see. Oh, I'm getting loads of them coming in. This is brilliant. And then I'd also like to ask you to think about how you feel when you think about the ocean. And again, just pop those answers in the chat and I'll come back and have a look after we've finished with the presentation today. So thank you for that. So it'd be really great to see all your responses. I guess one of the key things, and one of the things that all of you on this call will know, is that none of us really need to think very hard about how connected we are to the ocean. That's something that feels quite accepted and intrinsic to who we are as a community here on this call. And of course, the ocean has been a connector across time and space for trade and transport for generations in a range of different ways. And one of the things that Nori, I think you mentioned at the beginning, or maybe it was before we talked, is about really thinking about how we can use this momentum behind ocean literacy that's really happened in the last couple of years to think about how we can kind of think about cross-sector, cross-policy, and really deliver change for the ocean, coast, seas, and kind of the whole system, really. And of course, that relationship isn't new. It's something that's been around for generations, looking back at the traditional maritime industries, and that's all transferring and emerging into these new blue economy narratives, thinking about the health and well-being aspects and kind of the growth of the Victorian seaside spa towns and how that really influenced how people thought about the coast. And of course, the cruise liners connecting these very disparate geographies. And so that relationship has always been there. And of course, it's changed over time. Places like Wales, places like Ireland, where conversely to Canada, where so many of us live, work and operate so close to the coast. So in Wales, where I'm based, over 60% of us live and work within 50 kilometres of the coast. And I'm sure it's the same in Ireland. So most of our populations are really grounded in those spaces. And although people have been exploring that kind of very complex relationship between people in the ocean a little bit, it's only really very recently, maybe in the last 10 years or so, where there's been this real increase in kind of public calls and policy calls for better understanding those relationships between people and the ocean and coast. And that's where you're seeing this real increase in marine social sciences research. And these are just some of the very recent papers that have been highlighting and showcasing this kind of forward-looking research agenda around marine social sciences. I am a convert, so I was a marine biologist when I started out, and I have been working in marine social sciences for about 15 years now. And these papers are really just starting to kind of highlight where our knowledge gaps are, where the priorities for the future should be, and really taking account of that very diverse set of disciplines and research fields that feed into this broad term marine social sciences, which is what I call myself. This is a diagram or some images from a paper by Nathan Bennett, who is an excellent conservation social scientist, and these research areas and these kind of research methodologies are very framed around conservation social science generally, but they can be applied to the marine and coastal spaces. So they include things like history and art, education, law, humanities, socio-ecological studies, economics, sociology, human geography, all of those things that you'd expect to see within the social sciences. And crucially, we're starting to see a move away from a real dependence on things like questionnaires and interviews, which of course are great ways of understanding relationships between people and their environment. But as Diz said, really thinking about those diverse methods to how we unpick those relationships and help people understand quite complex and complicated science, and also help us understand complex relationships. So we're really seeing the use of much more creative approaches to understand these relationships. And I think that's really embedded in the work that's happening around ocean literacy at the moment. So we've seen that happening over recent years. Things like the Google Earth Discover the Ocean platforms, Blue Planet 2, of course, really highlighted, what can happen if you get a really excellent campaign behind a particular topic around marine plastics, and that caused real change really quickly. It's kind of ocean literacy in action, really, and really kind of gain that policy impact across the globe. From a research perspective, so for me sitting in a university, increasingly we're hearing kind of calls for us to not only publish our papers and give these sorts of talks, but also think about how we can engage with communities and think about how we can do community outreach and citizen science projects and get feedback on the work we're doing, to really think about that impact and that two-way dialogue between science, research, communities, policy and practice, and all of those different aspects that feed into this kind of the journey we're on in terms of implementing all this great stuff around ocean literacy. And as I said, we're seeing these really beautiful and increasingly creative ways of engaging people with these topics. This is from an exhibition that was actually held in Nova Scotia a few years ago. And I love the type of Sea in Her Blood. And it was all about the women around Nova Scotia who had worked and lived and engaged with the sea in different ways. And you could weave your own story into this huge loom of ribbons. So we're starting to see increasing projects that are exploring the relationships between people and their ocean and coastal spaces in a range of different ways. We've got things like the SOPHIE project, which is thinking about, of course, ocean and human health. There's things like Cherish, which is an Interreg Ireland-Wales funded project, and that's looking at the impact of climate change on cultural heritage around coastal spaces. There's Pericles, which is a European project, again, looking at cultural heritage. And the People, Ocean, Planet and the We Are Ocean initiatives, which are all around understanding the relationships between people, ocean and planet. And for me, crucially, one of the key things is that we're recognizing this diversity of audiences. So every one of us on this call, everybody represented in each of these images here, will have a really different relationship between themselves and the ocean and coast, and of course, nature more generally. But it's important that when we think about ocean literacy, that we account for those differences, that we recognise that not everybody will respond to the same messages, they won't care about the same things, they won't connect to the same thing. And really crucial, I think one of the key points for me is that we also perhaps need to reimagine what we mean by coastal communities. So this image in the kind of bottom right of my screen of the aquarium, I put that in because I think we often focus in on coastal communities, and as Diz said, there are places across the world where actually quite a lot of people don't live by the coast or are perhaps quite physically disconnected. And perhaps the Ocean Decade gives us an opportunity to reimagine what we mean by these traditional coastal communities and expands that definition and recognise that actually we're all ocean or coastal citizens and we're all connected to the ocean. And I really have that hope for the Ocean Decade as we move forward. So you'll all be aware that the Ocean Decade launched earlier this year, and ocean literacy has been really kind of underpinning a lot of the work that's been happening around that. For me, the Ocean Decade, we're very much still at the start of that, but I think the aspiration to include this interdisciplinary perspectives, the inclusion of local Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing, as Diz was saying, is a real strong point for me for the decade. And the fact that although ocean literacy has been around for 20 years or so, the Ocean Decade has definitely given it speed and momentum that it didn't have even 5 years ago. So it's a real opportunity for us to take action and make waves across ocean governance globally. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about some work that's happened here in the UK just in the last year or so. We were looking at some work to understand what we meant by ocean literacy in England and Wales, and this involved a 3-phase piece of work. One was to do a bit of an assessment about what ocean literacy meant in 2021, whether the current models and constructs were really fit for purpose and would actually deliver behaviour change. And then we did an ocean literacy assessment in England and Wales earlier this year, so carried out in February and March of this year, with over 8,000 respondents, which was a really great number of responses, including non-coastal communities, which is my bugbear. So it was great to have that in there. The results were launched on World Ocean Day in June, and I'll come to some of the results in just a second. But just as I said, the first phase was really to explore how ocean literacy has evolved over that last 20 years. And we looked at models of environmental citizenship, marine citizenship, public perceptions, and tried to map that against some of the existing dimensions of ocean literacy. So things like knowledge and attitudes and awareness and behaviour that you'd expect to see, but also other things like communication and activism that have been mentioned by previous authors. A paper by Brennan et al. Explored those. And through this mapping exercise, we really highlighted that actually there's a real need for us to think about emotions when we're talking about ocean literacy. As Diz said, we don't act on what we know, we act on what we feel and what we care about. We also identified things like access, experience and proximity to the coast as being really crucial to that connection between ocean and coastal spaces. Understanding motivations, trust and transparency, and understanding diverse social values as being areas that we perhaps wanted to expand into the survey that we were designing. So as I said, the results of the survey came out in June of this year. And just to give you some really high level figures, 85% of respondents indicated that protecting the marine environment was important to them. So that gives us something to act on. That gives government a bit of a mandate to say, okay, there's actually a huge public will for this. And in Welsh Government, we are talking about feeding some of these results into ongoing work around post-COVID blue recovery. And we had a meeting just this week around how we can put proposals to Welsh Government to take some of these findings forward. In terms of the knowledge component, there's a really varied knowledge around certain marine related terms. And I guess we have to question how much that matters. So is a person more ocean literate because they know more terminology, or are they more ocean literate because they have more of an emotional connection, or is it a mix of both? Does it vary? And I think it's important for us to think about those different dimensions of ocean literacy as we continue to move through the decade. 36% of people felt their lifestyle had no impact on the marine environment whatsoever. And I always find this really interesting. The UK is an island. I mean, it might be made up of different countries, but it is essentially an island. And so for 36% of people to say that their lifestyles have no impact on the marine environment suggests perhaps a disconnect between that everyday role of the ocean and coast in our everyday lives. And that's, again, something for us to really think about and think about how we engage people on that topic. And there are other things like increased recognition of the benefits of blue space, which I'm sure you will all be aware of. One thing I wanted to draw your attention to was the responses to the 7 ocean literacy principles, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. We wanted to explore those because we were wanting to understand whether or not they are fit for going out to the wider public and whether people really engage with them. I think there were some really interesting results. So, for example, one of the big campaigns around the ocean literacy narrative over the last couple of years has been around the One Ocean initiative and the fact that the Earth has one big ocean with many features. And actually, quite a few people weren't so sure about that. And I always find these sorts of things quite interesting. What is a level of agreement with some of these statements? So although there are degrees of agreement with all of the statements, so even 52% of people agreed that so that it was completely true that oceans and humans are inextricably linked. 25% of people only said, oh, it's mostly true. And I find those sorts of things really, really interesting for us to explore further. In terms of emotional connection, concern was the biggest emotion identified in the responses, so 49%. We still have things like awe and wonder, curiosity, happiness, calm and relax. So it's great to try and help us understand some of that emotional insight into how people are relating to those ocean and coastal spaces. We asked people which things they felt posed the most threat to the marine environment in England and Wales. And of course, as expected, I think marine litter and plastic pollution came up as the highest thing there. Climate change came in at 50%, and we're really interested to know if that will change, particularly post COP26 a couple of weeks ago. And we'll be rerunning this survey next year. So it'll be interesting to see how these things have changed in response to media coverage and different political decisions that have happened in the meantime. The benefits of the marine environment to society were also explored. They identified things like diverse habitats being the most important benefit. And again, I was quite surprised at that, actually, that it wasn't kind of more the food to eat, perhaps, or the recreational value. It was diversity, and food to eat came in second. But then there was this recognition of the role of weather and climate control, which is really great to see. And then we were starting to ask about what people can do to change their own behaviour. How can they help with the environment, with the marine environment? And of course, you've seen things like single-use plastics, agricultural runoff was a key one that came up. And we're trying to think about how we can integrate that into discussions around catchment to coast initiatives and that whole system management that I think Mihal will kind of touch on in his talk shortly. Thinking about how we communicate with our diverse audience and what we need to do to raise awareness. Think about a different media, so schools, formal education, so perhaps tapping into that knowledge background of ocean literacy actually came down quite low, with only 10% of people identifying that as the key place where they find out their information. So television, social media, those sorts of communication platforms are really crucial for us moving forward. I'm going to skip past this slide just in the interest of time, but the report's available. I can pop the link in the chat for you shortly. And then moving on with what's happening next, we are actively taking these results and feeding this into a new suite of projects. So these are 6 projects that were funded in September of this year, all very interdisciplinary, bringing really strong natural and social science teams together. I'm involved in this one, the Integrating Diverse Values into Management, and we'll be talking directly around ocean literacy. So I'm leading a work package on ocean literacy in this project, and we'll be taking the results of that national survey and starting to hopefully use some of the more diverse and creative methods that Diz was talking about in the Canadian work to unpick and explore what ocean literacy means in 3 test sites across the UK. So one in Wales around the Severn Estuary, one on the south coast of England around Portsmouth and Sussex, and then the Shetland Islands, which I am very, very excited about getting to go to.
Emma, sorry, you have just 1 minute left. Is that okay?
That is absolutely fine. Yeah, no worries. I will go on to this final slide. So I guess my main point really is to highlight the role of understanding coastal communities and the opportunities that ocean literacy affords us for doing that. Of course, coastal communities are central to supporting sustainable use of the ocean. Funding is a topic that I know Diz mentioned, and that's really crucial. This engagement and outreach and understanding of our communities shouldn't be an afterthought. We need to make sure that we're taking that interdisciplinary perspective and that we use these best practice approaches to understanding and engaging with coastal communities moving forward. So I'm going to skip forward to this slide just to end, because I think it's really important that we think about why we're understanding and working in this space of ocean literacy. So of course, understanding ecology, biology is really important, but to deliver change, we must understand people. This quote from Elliot Norse. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Emma. That was fantastic. And